My parents had always preached that it was my duty to lift my brother up, so I did. I lifted him until he had the perfect vantage point to drop me off a cliff. I came home from my son's astronomy club showcase with the scent of buttery popcorn still clinging to my coat to find the door to my home office slightly ajar. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach as I saw the specialized, climate-controlled fireproof portfolio case lay open like a gaping wound. The original, hand-drawn vellum blueprints for the new city library were gone, not just copies, but the signed and sealed master set representing $50,000 in intellectual property and countless hours of my life. I sank into my chair as the world narrowed to a pinpoint because that morning, my brother, Julian, had been over for brunch, charming my kids and borrowing $200 he'd never repay. Julian was a 32-year-old failed musician, a man-child perpetually on the verge of a breakthrough while financing his artistic temperament with our parents' retirement fund, a professional leech with a poet's soul, or so he claimed. Staring at the empty case, I knew. When I found Julian in his disaster of an apartment where the air was thick with the cloying sweetness of vape smoke and stale pizza, he was hunched over a brand new synthesizer, propping up his monitor with one of my rolled-up blueprints, its corner already creased. "Relax, Clara," he said with a dismissive smirk when I demanded them back, not even looking up. "It's just paper. What are a few drawings compared to my art? This synth is my future." I tried to explain with my voice shaking that these were the master copies that represented my entire career and the legacy I hoped to leave my children, but he just waved me off. "You're a fancy architect with a big firm, just draw new ones. It's not like you do the real work anyway." The insult was so casual and cutting it stole my breath, so I left his apartment and drove straight to my parents' house with a desperate, primal need for them to finally see him for who he was. I didn't even get a word out before my mother's face hardened into a mask of disappointment. "Julian called, hysterical," she said sharply. "How could you storm over there and derail his creative process? He's finally making progress." My father, a retired civil engineer who once taught me the beauty of a perfectly executed plan, just shook his head and said, "You've never understood the pressures of being a true artist, Clara. You're too rigid." They demanded I apologize for stressing him out, seeing his fragility but never his poison. In that moment, staring at the two people who were supposed to be my staunchest defenders, I understood that the most satisfying revenge is not loud and explosive, but cold, meticulously planned, and served with receipts. I spent the next 2 weeks on a mission and couldn't just buy back the blueprints because the damage was done. Instead, I hired a private investigator named Miller who specialized in corporate espionage, and he found them within days, sold for a pittance to a rival architectural firm known for cutting corners. I didn't just want the plans back, I wanted to build a case, so I spent $30,000 of my own money to document the illegal sale, gathering sworn affidavits, bank transfer records, and security footage of Julian meeting with the rival architect. My plan was going to be worth every single cent. The stage was set at my firm's annual gala, a glittering affair celebrating our recent successes where all our clients, colleagues, and the city's most influential developers filled the grand ballroom. Just before the main course, I walked to the podium with my heart hammering against my ribs and tapped the microphone. "Julian," I announced, my voice clear and steady, "since you felt my work would be better appreciated by another firm, I've taken the liberty of documenting your transaction and would like to present a small exhibit on corporate espionage and intellectual property theft." With a click of a button, the massive screen behind me lit up with Miller's photos, the damning bank transfers, and screenshots of emails between Julian and the rival firm. The silence was a physical force, heavy and suffocating, and Julian's face drained of all color, a stark white against the ballroom's dim lighting. He was trapped and couldn't explode, not with my senior partner staring at him with cold fury, and not with the head of the city planning commission looking at him as if he were something she'd scraped off her shoe. But on the drive home, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a hollow ache because the public humiliation felt petty, a victory that tasted like ash. The next morning, consumed by a lifetime of conditioned guilt, I drove to his apartment not with anger, but with an offer. I paid off his $40,000 in gambling debts, the real reason he'd stolen from me, and I paid for him to enter a high-end, 90-day treatment program with therapists and scenic views. I visited him every Sunday, listening to the counselors praise my unwavering support, and the more they praised me, the more he seemed to resent it, a subtle tightening around his eyes the only sign. Still, I allowed myself to hope it would be enough. He got out 90 days later, and something had shifted because the resentment was no longer subtle, it was a palpable aura. He started driving by my construction sites at odd hours and knew my meeting schedules, texting me passive-aggressive comments like, "Hope the rebar is up to code." I told myself I wasn't worried, that he was a con artist, not a saboteur. 3 weeks later, I was at the topping-out ceremony for the new library, a milestone in any architect's career, and the final steel beam was being hoisted into place. As I was shaking hands with the mayor, a fleet of city vehicles screeched to a halt at the perimeter while inspectors, engineers, and officials poured out, waving a stop work order. We received an anonymous tip, the lead inspector announced through a megaphone for the news cameras that had suddenly appeared. There are critical flaws in the structural calculations. This building is a public hazard. My world tilted on its axis as they swarmed the site, my site, while I was forced to stand behind yellow tape with my face broadcast on the evening news. The K9 units weren't for substances, they were for sniffing out unauthorized, substandard materials in the concrete pours, and they found them. In a section of the foundation, they discovered evidence of cheap, brittle steel rebar, the kind that would have been impossible to detect without knowing exactly where to look. And that's when I saw him, Julian, standing across the street, half hidden behind a food truck with a faint, satisfied smile on his lips, making sure his anonymous tip had paid off exactly as planned. My business partner of 15 years wouldn't meet my eye, and I was escorted off my own site by the flash of cameras. My son, Leo, saw it on the news after school and called me, his voice trembling, asking if the building was going to fall down and if it was my fault. The question was a physical blow. The ride back to my office was a blur of frantic calls and canceled contracts, and the city's building commission met us there. They didn't need to say much because my license was suspended pending a full investigation. At the emergency board meeting, I recognized one of the junior members, Mark, who had been in Julian's band years ago, and his expression wasn't angry, just disappointed. "Your father is going to be devastated," he said quietly. My father, the retired engineer who had taught me how to read blueprints and bragged to everyone about his daughter, the architect. My one call was to my parents, and it went straight to voicemail. "Mom, Dad, it's Clara. My license has been suspended." "It's a lie, Julian framed me, he sabotaged the site. I need you. Please." The machine cut me off mid-plea. I was put on administrative leave while my partners, facing millions in liability, initiated proceedings to dissolve our firm and sue me personally. My court-appointed attorney was completely out of his depth. "The evidence of negligence is overwhelming," he said, shuffling papers, "the altered supply manifests, the compromised materials, we're talking about financial ruin, Clara, possibly criminal charges." "But I didn't do it," I pleaded. "Someone got into our system, changed the orders, paid off a supplier." He looked at me with pity and said, "Possession is 9/10 of the law. It's your firm, your name on the plans. From a legal standpoint, you're responsible." The preliminary hearing was a nightmare with a room full of reporters, and Julian sat in the back, looking concerned, occasionally shaking his head with sorrow. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for being tough on corporate malfeasance, read the injunctions that froze my assets and barred me from all my own project sites. They assigned me a case manager from the Professional Standards Board, and when she asked for an emergency contact, I had no one else to give but Julian Thorne, my brother. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper, and asked, "The same Julian Thorne who filed the initial ethics complaint?" I just nodded, and she knew. She'd seen family use the system as a weapon before, but it didn't mean she could do anything about it. I found a temporary, non-licensed job at a tiny firm, doing mind-numbing drafting work for a woman named Eleanor, a brilliant architect who'd lost her own firm 20 years ago in a similar scandal. "First rule of a professional frame-up," she told me over coffee one day, "is they make you look guilty of your greatest fear." Meticulous architect? Accuse her of negligence. Your brother is either a genius or he had help. She explained the blueprint to falsify digital records, bribe a low-level supplier, then tip off the press and the authorities. They don't care who did it, she said, her voice bitter with experience, they care whose name is on the door. My first video call with my kids was supervised by a court-appointed monitor, with my parents and Julian hovering in the background. Clara, honey, my mother began, maybe this is for the best, a little time away from the stress will help you clear your head. I'm not stressed, Mom, I was framed. Denial is a common response to extreme pressure, she said, parroting a line Julian had clearly fed her, and he leaned into the frame, mouthing the words, I told you. My mother explained that Leo was having nightmares about collapsing buildings and that my daughter, Maya, was getting into fights at school, defending my honor. The call ended with my son asking if we were going to lose our house. The notice from the bank arrived the next day, and with my assets frozen, I'd missed a mortgage payment and had 30 days. Then came the article in the city's main paper, Star Architects Fall from Grace, which featured a terrible photo of me being escorted from the library site. The comments were vicious, and there, under his own name, was Julian, praying for my sister as she navigates this personal and professional crisis. Our family is here to support her on the path to accountability and healing. He had turned my ruin into his redemption. 3 days later, my parents and Julian filed for temporary guardianship of my children. Given the ongoing investigation and financial instability, the CPS worker explained, the court is leaning toward family placement. Your brother has been very proactive. Proactive, that's what they called it when he destroyed my life and was now being praised for sorting through the rubble. He's a gambling addict, I told her, he has a record. She consulted her file and said, Mr. Thorne provided proof of completing a treatment program, he has a new job in finance, and he has your parents' support. I'm sorry, but from the court's perspective, you are a professional liability and he is a stable provider. My best friend, Nina, a tech genius who had been my project manager, visited that weekend while her husband, David, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He's been trying to get your login credentials, she whispered, slipping me a flash drive. He's telling everyone he needs access to your accounts to protect the kid's inheritance. I've locked down everything I can. At the bottom of a list of secured accounts, she'd written, David says I can't be involved, he's worried about our own finances. Don't trust anyone. The next blow came from the architecture industry blogs where my name was mud and my mugshot-like photo from the news was everywhere. In every comment section, there was Julian, weaving a tale of a sister he loved but who had succumbed to pressure. He started a blog called Rebuilding from the Rubble, a brother's story, which was full of poignant reflections on family loyalty, and he'd started a crowdfunding campaign to cover the family's legal and living expenses that had already raised $10,000. My lawyer quit because his firm couldn't handle the liability, and his replacement was a public defender who called me Carla and asked if I'd considered a plea bargain to make it all go away. In family court, I appeared via a grainy video feed from my lawyer's office while Julian was there in a tailored suit. My parents testified that I had been erratic and obsessed with work for months, and the judge granted temporary custody to them and Julian. I watched my brother's face as he looked serene. He hadn't just stolen my blueprints, he'd stolen my life. That night, Eleanor found me crying at my drafting table. The clock is ticking, she said firmly. Every day you spend buried in paperwork is another day he solidifies his story. Addicts and con men are meticulous when they plan their crime, they get sloppy when they think they've won. She was right, the clock was ticking for him, too. Now, with my children, my parents' trust, and control of my finances, the clock was ticking for both of us, and the only question was which timer would run out first, his luck or my fight. He started posting pictures from my house with my kids, writing, making sure the kids feel at home while their mom gets the help she needs. #family first. Nina, risking her marriage, worked tirelessly and said, he's smart, he used a VPN and wiped the server logs. But she found a fragment, a ghost in the machine, a deleted invoice to a steel supplier, paid from an offshore account that our PI eventually traced back to an online poker site Julian frequented. It was a start. The video calls with my children were torture as Maya was quiet and withdrawn, and Leo, coached by his uncle, asked, why did you build a broken building, Mom? My new lawyer, a bulldog recommended by Eleanor, discovered Julian's girlfriend, a paralegal, had been filing requests for all my case documents, so he knew our every move. The PI found something else, that Julian had a new, full-time job at a wealth management firm which he'd gotten using a forged recommendation letter written on my company's letterhead. My father visited me, a broken man, and admitted Julian had been asking for money again. But he's good with the kids, he pleaded, just sign over the company, let the insurance pay out, we can make this go away. The foreclosure on my house was finalized, and the news ran a segment interviewing Julian on my front lawn as he spoke sorrowfully about the pressures that lead good people to make bad choices. Behind him, the custom rose garden I designed was dying. My new lawyer brought a sliver of hope when a former employee at the steel supply company was arrested on an unrelated charge and was willing to talk in exchange for a deal. He confirmed a man matching Julian's description paid him cash to swap out a shipment. My father, finally seeing the truth, used his retirement savings to hire a forensic engineering team, and they found the exact point of sabotage, a detail only a skilled engineer or someone who'd stolen the master plans could have known. I befriended a librarian at my kid's school, desperate for information, and learned Maya had stopped drawing entirely, the art had died in her. Julian's girlfriend announced her pregnancy in family court, a calculated blow, and the judge, moved, extended his temporary custody. I missed Leo's 10th birthday while Julian live-streamed a party from a lavish rental, paid for with my money. I took a second job, cleaning offices at night, and one of them was my old firm where my supervisor made me polish the glass plaque with my own name on it. The PI uncovered Julian's practice run, a university classmate he got expelled for plagiarism, now working as a barista who was too afraid to talk. My lawyer discovered Julian's real goal in the family court documents, a petition to have me declared professionally incompetent, which would trigger a clause in my father's will, giving Julian control of the entire family estate. He planned to erase me. Nina, through a contact, got a warrant to search Julian's cloud storage, and they found it, a hidden folder with the original, unaltered blueprints. It was the smoking gun. The night before the civil trial, Julian visited me and offered a deal. If I accepted a settlement admitting negligence, he would drop the guardianship petition. I looked him in the eye and said, I would rather lose my children forever as an innocent woman than keep them through a lie. The trial was my last stand as the ex-employee testified, and Nina took the stand, showing the jury the digital ghost of the deleted invoice and the pristine blueprints from Julian's cloud. Julian took the stand and delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar, crying about his gambling addiction but swearing he only stole money and would never endanger the public. The verdict came back, and the jury found me not liable for criminal negligence, but the firm was still responsible for the damages, a partial victory that felt like a total defeat. Family court moved swiftly, and with the evidence from the civil trial, Julian's custody was revoked, but the children were placed in my parents' full-time care as the judge cited my bankruptcy and the unstable nature of my professional life. I moved into a small apartment with Nina, whose husband had left her, and my license was reinstated, but my reputation was gone. I started my own small firm, working out of my living room, designing kitchen remodels and small additions. Supervised visits with my kids were my only lifeline, and Maya started drawing again while Leo refused to speak to Julian. My mother, her health failing from the stress, still believed Julian was just a victim of his disease. 6 months later, at the final custody hearing, I was granted joint custody. Julian was facing fraud charges, and his girlfriend had left him. It wasn't the life I had built, but it was a life I was rebuilding. I drove past my old house sometimes where a new family lived and had torn out the rose garden. Leo once asked if I hated Uncle Julian, and I told him the truth, that I hated what he did, but he was my brother, broken in ways I couldn't fix, and we were all just survivors of the same fractured family. The last time I saw him was in a courtroom, looking small and tired, and he asked if I thought he'd ever get better. I didn't have an answer because some foundations are cracked beyond repair. But every weekend, I picked up my children, and we went to museums and looked at buildings. Maya started designing her own fantasy houses, and Leo got a telescope, his eyes fixed on building worlds of his own, far away from the rubble of ours.